Amanda, half of Commissioner Royce under the main DP, and I am Director for the Bureau of Remediation and Waste Management.
Good afternoon, I'm Nancy McBrady. I'm the Bureau Director for the Bureau of Agriculture, Food and Rural Resources within the Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Forestry, here to present today as well.
I'm Jenny Tolton-Flood, dairy farmer from Clinton, Maine, representing agriculture.
Keisha Holmes from Whiskey Brook Farm in Albion, Maine, also represents agriculture.
Diane Nolan, the Dean of College of Natural Sciences, Forestry and Ag, and the Director of the Experiment Station.
I'm Jim Buckle from the Buckle Farm in Unity, representing ag.
Adrian Lee, New Wheat Farm, Knox, Maine.
I'm Beth Valentine. I'm Director of PFAS Fund at Department of Ag.
Great, and we have a handful of committee members via Zoom. Sherry Hamill.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, I am actually on a ferry off the coast of South Carolina. So if I lose connection, I'll try to get back as soon as I can.
And Dr. Shaw.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Nirav Shah, the Director of the Maine CDC.
And Senator Bennett.
Good afternoon. I'm Rick Bennett. I have the honor of serving a bunch of towns in Western Maine in the Maine Senate.
Great, and I think that's it for the committee via Zoom. Is Rebecca Bowles?
I'm here.
Oh, okay. There you
Sorry,
are.
good afternoon. Becca Bolas, Executive Director, Maine Public Health Association.
Wonderful, welcome. And is that everybody that's on Zoom?
Yes. We're still waiting on Representative Paul, who I understand will be here shortly.
It's hard not controlling the Zoom meeting feature because I can't get in their seats participating. I feel a little handicapped. Okay, so thank you all so much for joining us. And the goal of today's meeting is for all of us to have, as committee members, a broad understanding of the ongoing PFAS here in the state of Maine. So we'll have presentations from Department of Ag, the Department of Environmental Protection, and from the state toxicologist. We're also hoping to start to identify the priorities related to farmer assistance, health monitoring, and research. And for all of us as committee members to start to select subcommittees that we would like to put our talents forward to participate in. We will, Representative Fay will guide us through our ground rules that we'll agree upon for the meeting today and those meetings going forward. And we'll also discuss and vote on a remote meeting policy so that those folks that are attending via Zoom specifically today and then ongoing will be able to participate remotely in our meetings. All right, do you want to walk us through ground rules?
Yeah, sure. And I'm not sure if everyone has a copy of the ground rules. I think they were sent out with the meeting invitation. So I just want to go over them really quickly. Oh, and look, they're up there on the screen.
Can we pause just a minute? People on Zoom, can you see the screen?
No, we cannot.
Okay. I'm afraid I don't know how to fix that.
No, but we have the materials that was sent out and I'm looking at them on my laptop, so.
Yep.
Good.
Great. So just to quickly go over them, and then certainly if folks have input, I think that's important as well. So meetings start and end on time. Today accepted. Once we'll get the technology straightened out, I think that we can expect meetings to start and end on time. I think it would be helpful to our conversation and the expedience of the meetings to have everyone come prepared and having read all of the materials in advance. Everyone hopefully will be present and engaged. And I think it's really important to make sure that all the voices are heard. So everyone is here for an important reason, and making sure that folks feel comfortable to participate fully in the conversation will help us do a better job. Listening with curiosity and an openness to learning and understanding. Adopting a creative problem-solving orientation. Committing to working towards consensus. And just a reminder that all meeting materials are public and comments are on the record. And then I do want to just open it up if anyone has any additions or comments about the expectations. Great. I think these are good ground rules, and I think they will be really helpful as we guide our conversation. And then we were also going to talk about the remote meeting policy. Did everyone have a chance to go over that? I don't know that I necessarily need to read it. Is everyone comfortable with the remote meeting policy as stated? And I think we do have to vote on it.
I'm comfortable with it.
So, I'm sorry, Senator Bennett, can you say that again?
I said, I'm comfortable with it speaking remotely.
Perfect, perfect. Do we need a roll call vote?
Yeah.
Who are you?
You want me to call the roll?
Sure.
Sure. Right there. Perfect.
Senator Bennett,
Vote aye.
Representative Fay,
Aye.
Representative Hall. That's not back yet. Commissioner Beal.
Aye.
Representative Wilson is not here. Dr. Shaw,
Aye.
Professor Rowland. Rowland. Sherry Hamill,
Yes, I'm good with it. Thanks.
Jim Buckle,
Aye.
Steve Crane,
Aye.
Jenny Tilton Flab. Tasha Holmes. Aye. Adrian Lee. Aye. Rebecca Bolus.
Aye.
Just a procedural question. I know Commissioner Wilson's not here, but Suzanne is, so does she vote?
Good question. My pen just ran out of ink. I don't think so.
Well, it does say Commissioner or the designee
Okay,
in the statute.
okay,
And on behalf of me for today.
yes. All right. Great, and I'm a yes. And that's everybody, so that's unanimous.
Great. So I will turn it back over to Senator Brenner.
Okay, so our next topic will be to review the purpose and the fund and the timeline. And I believe you're going to walk us through that.
Yep.
Yeah, great.
So as I think you all know, the broad purpose of the $60 million fund is to support producers impacted by PFAS contamination of agricultural land and water. The fund was established by the legislature and is housed in the commissioner's office here at DICF. Our first task is to create a plan with the advice of this committee that prioritizes funding and sets the criteria and processes to be used when making funding decisions. The department has discretion to use the fund for a variety of purposes that can be classified under the headings of farmer assistance, health, research, and other. Potential uses include direct support to farmers, blood testing and medical monitoring, research into things such as alternative cropping systems, and education, marketing, and regional planning. We'll be spending most of this meeting looking at the categories of farmer assistance, health, and research, and to give you an overview of existing efforts going on within the state, and then to just start the discussion of where we want to begin tackling these issues. The steps in the process. First phase was laying the groundwork. The fund was established in April when the governor signed the bill. I was hired as the director in September. This advisory committee was formed in October. We've had an initial orientation meeting to review our statutory charge and to set expectations about meeting norms and timeline, things like that. So now we're at the very beginning of the planning stage. Our first working meeting is today. We plan to meet monthly for approximately 6 months, and then after that, hopefully we can space the meetings out a little bit more. This is also going to be a public process. Our first public meeting hearing to take input from the public is during the agricultural trade show on January 11th, I believe. Once we have a draft of the plan, we will again have to go out for public comment. I'm hoping we can have a draft of the plan by April. Schedule the hearings soon thereafter, finalize the plan a month after that, so meet in the May timeframe. And then we move into implementation, which will involve establishing internal policies and procedures. We may have to go through procurement to contract for services, for example. There may be discrete portions of the program where we have to go to rulemaking, so that is a rather lengthy process. So given all that, we probably won't begin distributing funds until the fall of 2023 in significant amounts. But that said, in addition to these broad subject areas that the department has been tasked with addressing, we've also been given a directive to establish a short-term assistance program that may include income replacement and mortgage payments as soon as practicable is the term used in the legislation. So one thing we should consider is whether in the near term, the fund should take over responsibility for the income replacement program that is currently being managed by the Bureau of Agriculture, Food and Rural Resources. And Director McBrady will be speaking about the Bureau's program shortly. And then the final phase is review and refine. This will be ongoing. We'll have annual reports due to the legislature, but also as we acquire more knowledge about remediation measures, mitigation measures, as more impacted farms are identified. This is very much a fluid process, so it'll be an ongoing process of review and revision. So those are the phases of development. And now I will turn the program over to other presenters to speak about ongoing programs, starting with the Department of Environmental Protection, and then Maine Farmland Trust, MOFGA, Emergency Relief Fund, and then returning to the Bureau within the department to speak about ongoing farmer assistance programs here. So let me get out of this.
It's a lot of pressure to have everyone see what you.
Yeah.
What's your hand that moves in your mouth.
So Suzanne, whenever you're ready, and I'll just advance as you tell me.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure if the bottom part of that's a little bit cut off, so there you go. Yeah, I don't know if that matters to this person. You can just go ahead and go on to the next one. So, hello, everybody. Thanks for allowing me the opportunity to present where we're at with PFAS at the Maine DEP. I'm going to talk a little bit about our soil and groundwater investigation, but I'm going to also talk about other things that are going on at the Maine DEP as well. So basically, where are PFAS in Maine? We found them in groundwater, surface water, soils, plants, and wildlife. And we've learned that all in the past few years, especially. Some of the sources of PFAS come from sludge and septic land application, which is really where we've learned a lot about how PFAS is impacting farms. We also have PFAS from contaminated and remediation sites that we have statewide. Those are administered by different programs at the Maine DEP, but they're still important sources to consider when thinking about where PFAS might come from. Some of these contaminated remediation sites are federal facilities, things like airports, fire training stations, things like that. There may be PFAS also associated with some active and closed landfills. As many of you are aware, we've been testing leachate at active landfills, landfills that have active leachate collection systems. But we're also looking at PFAS from our closed municipal landfill program. We've got 400 of those in the state. We have one staff person for all of them, and they're actively looking at trying to find out what that link is between those closed landfills and whether or not some of those are actual sources of PFAS. So there are some active business operations currently in place that utilize some PFAS, and so they are also a source. And then, of course, agricultural operations can also be a source based on the movement and where things are going and moving around agricultural fields and whatnot. So we can go on to the next slide.
How would you want to?
I'm advancing these in Zoom audience.
Okay, so before we start on talking about the soil and water investigation, I want to just mention that in addition to getting a grasp of where things are at for our investigation, it's really important to understand where are we at generally as a whole in Maine. And so in April, the department completed through its contractor a background study on soils and PFAS and soils in Maine. And so generally, and not surprisingly, we found that there are various PFAS at varying levels throughout Maine soils. All of that detail is in the report. I would recommend, if you're interested in looking at it, to scroll towards the back of the report, look at table 9, because that's where all the good stuff is. It basically will tell you what PFAS compound and what was found, and there'll be some caveats that explain what the statistical information means. Also, I want to mention that the EPA is also doing some studies on wet deposition. So basically, rain, what's in our soil from rain. So if you advance on to the next slide, I will share a slide that we received from the EPA. This was taken from the EPA's Office of Research and Development. It's one of the first results they were willing to share with us. This is from Maine, Pasco Bay area. And there are a couple different PFAS compounds. You can see with the different color codes. And so there is PFAS coming from precipitation already in Maine. And the levels at which they're coming are notable if you compare those to the EPA health advisories that were issued back in June. So we do have it in the background, and I want to mention that I'm not trying to minimize anything. I just want to point out that there's this piece of it, and then as we go forward with our investigation, we're also learning more about what PFAS is in the environment as well. And so if we can go on to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about our soil and groundwater evaluation. So this is the soil and groundwater evaluation is related to the legislative requirement back in 2021 to basically investigate all of our land where we knew there was application of sludge and septic where it was licensed. So we looked through all of our licenses at the DEP to determine, where could sludge and septic have been land applied. And from that information, we wanted to learn about how those land application sites might, be a source to PFAS contamination and find out more about that. We estimated there was over 700 sites, sludge and septic sites statewide, and this is based on licensing from about the late 1970s through 2019. Half of all the sites have to be investigated, sampled by 2024, and all by 2025. And so if we go on to the next slide. We have the department prioritize those sites based on what they identified to be the highest risk. Thank you. Okay, so the department prioritized the sludge sites into tiers to determine which were at the highest risk. We wanted to really focus on what we thought would have the highest risk of PFAS contamination first, and then work our way down. And so how we made those determinations was based on what we were guided to do in legislation, but also what made sense, which was that it had to do with the amount of overall sludge land applied in the history of a particular site. Was there an anticipated presence of PFAS actually in the sludge? And what is the proximity of known receptors, meaning drinking water wells where drinking water could be impacted, or if it's a farm, for example, it's an active agricultural operation, or is it now a subdivision or something different like that? So what is the land being used for? And so those things all went into the evaluation. And so we have 4 tiers. The department is just about complete with its initial work in tier 1. We're waiting on some results to come back from work we contracted out. And we started our tier 2 sites, but we've not done the tier 3 or tier 4 sites yet, and that's going to be a little while yet. Septic sites we're managing differently because a lot of the septic application sites are still active. They're still actively licensed. They're still actively ongoing. Very different situation. A lot of the sludge sites were historical. They may have, or maybe they were used for 2 or 3 years over, back in the 80s, but they haven't been used since then. Whereas a lot of the septic sites are active and being used now. So it's a very different kind of management structure, licensing structure as well. And there's a lot less of them. And so that's why they're being managed separately. Those sites are currently being evaluated. We did about half this year. We're hoping to do the remainder next year. I'll talk a little bit about the investigation. So there's sort of this idea of an initial evaluation versus a full-fledged long-term evaluation. So with the mandate for the department to get in and out of these sites and have everything done by the end of 2025, we are doing an initial evaluation for all of this year's sites. We're making a decision based on the data we collect. Is this or is this the site we can move on to? The levels are all pretty low, so it's time to move on. And that's basically what we're doing. So if it's an area where it's time to move on, then we will move on. If it's an area where we expect there's going to be more long-term investigation, the department will continue to do that as we continue the rest of the tiered work with the evaluation process. So we do, Fairfield is a good example. We started investigating Fairfield when we began our initial work before the legislation was even passed, and we're still doing work in Fairfield now. So Fairfield's an example where it's a long-term investigation. There may be some other communities that fall into that load as well. Let's see. So you can find out more about the locations of each of these sites on our flood and septic mapper. We're actually looking to update that map shortly, so it should be a little bit more comprehensive. But right now, what we have on there is red and green dots. Green dots are it's just well water at this point that we're showing on our map. We're not showing soil data. I'll explain that in a second. Groundwater well data, and if it's a green dot, it means that the well tested under the state's interim drinking water standard, which means that's good green go, good to drink. Red means it tested above the state's interim drinking water standard. And in those cases, you might see a big blue diamond around a red dot, and that means the filtration system has been involved. You can click on those dots and it'll show you what the data was that was actually collected. So that's all on our website. You can type in your community and see if that information is up there yet. Soils data is a very different animal. We don't have a really great standard for soil. There's lots of different uses for soil. There's farming uses, there's playing in the backyard uses, there's going for hike uses. And so there's different standards for each of those functional use or activities. And so the one standard that we're looking at the Department of Environmental Protection is what we're calling the Residential Use Remediation Action Guideline. And just to explain, remediation action guidelines are typically used to kind of help when you're cleaning up a site. If you're cleaning up a site and this is going to be where somebody lives, this is the standard to which you want to have it cleaned up. So it's not really a perfect fit for PFAS. But as far as our soil results as far as our soil results have shown up till this point, none of our soil results have exceeded our residential use remediation action guidelines to date. So there'll be some more information coming about that hopefully soon. So moving on to the next slide, please. So basically, the department, when we go through our soil and water investigation, we spend quite a bit of time reviewing our old licenses to get a better idea of where actual sludge and septic application occurred on a piece of property. Our scientists use that information and they develop a site sampling and analysis plan that helps them understand where they need to take samples for the best results. We coordinate with landowners to schedule sampling events. We conduct our sampling, send those samples to the lab, get the lab results, communicate those results to the landowners. We have to evaluate at that point, depending on what the results are, whether a landowner needs bottled water or a filtration system. The state department will pay for treated water for residential homes where it exceeds the interim drinking water standard as part of this evaluation process. And then we have to determine if it's going to, again, be one of those longer term stepped out investigations. And there's a whole bunch of these actual stars next to them. And the reason I wanted to star those is to mention that through all those steps, we are actively coordinating with our sister agency over at Department of Agriculture. Our staff are constantly working with their staff to try to figure out what do we need to know about a specific piece of property to develop our sampling and analysis plans. How do we coordinate best with the landowners? How do we review, communicate lab results? Who's the best person to do that? Are there reasons that bottled water or filtration systems need to be expanded beyond residential usage? So, who pays for that and how do we coordinate that? And so those are all different things that we've learned to work with over the past year. And I think it's really important to mention that all of this was brand new about a year and a half ago. And so we kind of stumbled through it. We've learned a lot as we've gone forward and things are working, I would say, pretty smoothly right now. We have a pretty good system in place for most of these steps. Next slide, please. So just to emphasize here, the Department of Environmental Protection, our priority is to make sure everybody has safe drinking water that meets the state's interim drinking water standard. So to that end, if we find well water that exceeds the state's interim drinking water standard, we will provide bottled water and ultimately a filtration system for that residence. However, as mentioned, sometimes there's a situation where there's both a residence and maybe a separate farm irrigation system that needs a filtration system. And so we coordinate with the Department of Agriculture in terms of who's going to cover the design and installation and payment for that sort of operation. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd share some of the most recent data we have from our groundwater results statewide. I tallied up the numbers for the samples we've taken. We've taken over 1,100 samples so far. Statewide, on average, 72% have shown results lower than the state's interim drinking water standard. However, looking at certain communities, this may vary. So if you take the Fairfield area out, that number becomes a little bit lower. So there's a lot more residences in the Fairfield area that have shown results exceeding the 20 parts per billion. So as we tally more and more of the results, I'd say these numbers tend to be about the same. The statewide results not including Fairfield tend to be hovering around that 8%, 79%, 80% mark. But we have a lot more to learn. We have a lot more to sample. These numbers will change a little bit over time. But I think the key thing here, the key message here with all these numbers is that the results are not uniform throughout the state, and we just have a lot left to learn as we go forward. So next slide, please. So to that end, we're doing a lot of sampling. We've done over 1,100 just for the DEP for the groundwater sampling. That doesn't include all the soil sampling, doesn't include all the sampling all the other agencies are doing, and people are doing on their own, and research folks are doing. So a lot of sampling going on, and as I think everybody knows, there's been a issue with lab capacity getting the results back in a timely manner. And so the legislature during the last session, was very generous and included in part of the supplemental budget some additional money to help enhance lab capacity within the state of Maine. And so That was $3.2 million. And that, at this point in time, the department has selected 2 grantees. There is a little bit of money left over, so we're thinking about issuing an additional request for application to see if we can get somebody else to use the remainder of that money. It may not be for a full-fledged additional laboratory space, but maybe some kind of alternative mechanism for getting lab samples, I don't know, collected or sampled or analyzed somewhere. So that's something we need to do more into. Next slide, please. Also, at the end of the last legislative session, there was a lot of desire to have sludge no longer be land applied as a result of what we were finding in our initial study. And so the land application of sludge was prohibited in Maine as of August 8th. And that is going to lead right into what I'm going to talk about in the next slide. But before that, I want to mention that the Department of Environmental Protection is working on producing a study that will be presented to the legislature in January on whether or not there should be a ban on the land application of septic as well. Because as you may remember me saying earlier, septic is something where we do have some active licenses, and land application of septic is actively happening. Next slide, please. Okay, the reason I wanted to bring up the land application also was to discuss waste streams. So there's a lot of waste streams that come from possible areas where PFAS may be. So for example, we know we found some PFAS in water, we found PFAS in soil, we found PFAS in sludge and septic. From an agricultural perspective, we found PFAS in manure, we found it in milk, plants and crops, fertilizers, composts, some livestock, and also wildlife, fish, consumer products, and others. So there's a lot of different sources where there may be waste streams. And this is really important because now we have to figure out, well, what do we do with this stuff? So next slide, please. So the department has been tracking emerging treatment technologies. And it's not just the DEP. Somebody really wants to talk to me for an 801 number. So it's not just the DEP, it's the other state agencies as well. We meet regularly, monthly, actually, to talk about different treatment, disposal, and destruction technologies. There are a lot out there that are being talked about, but there's not a lot out there that are ready for prime time. So most of these, anything you see up on this list that has a star next to it is really still in its early phases of research. It's not ready to be implemented. In some cases, not even ready for pilot implementation yet. What we do have are disposal options. We can landfill PFAS waste. We can land apply it, which we really can't land apply sludge anymore in Maine, but we can land apply septic. We might be able to compost it, but we're still learning about compost. We're doing some trial runs by the department to learn more about that. As far as treatment and concentration technologies, we know that there are filtration system techniques that work, like granulated activated carbon. That's what we use in our filtration systems. Ion exchange, reverse osmosis. We're looking a lot more these days at foam fractionation, but all these other things like phytoremediation, pyrolysis, incineration, and all these other, basically a lot of these other destruction technologies involve high pressures and high temperatures. These are things that we just don't have enough data to know if it's actually going to work, that it's safe, that that's really going to destroy PFAS. And so we have to think about all of these technologies in terms of, can you destroy it, or is it just putting it somewhere else, and therefore we have to find another place to dispose of it. So next slide, please. So the key when we're looking at trying to get rid of PFAS is, how do we collect it? How do we concentrate it, maybe into a smaller volume? And then how do we destroy it? So what we have right now in Maine is an awful lot of contaminated soil that we need to get rid of. So do we just kind of dig up the whole top 6 inches of soil in Maine and do something with that? Or is it more important for us to really focus on technology that will help us collect it, concentrate that somehow, and then dispose of what's really heavily concentrated that's filtered out? And so so that's what we're really trying to learn more about, see what kinds of technologies will work, see what's going to fit into what's going on here in Maine specifically, because what we're learning here in Maine is different than what some of the other states are learning. So we're working on facilitating relationships between, state agencies, companies, and infrastructure that's started here in Maine, and trying to match methods for how do we concentrate PFAS into smaller volumes, or how do we destroy it. Next slide, please. So final considerations, there's just continues to be a very uncertain and shifting legal and regulatory landscape. That makes things very challenging for everybody in terms of how to manage PFAS, but it's especially difficult for farms who are trying to make decisions on what to do from year to year. Are landowners and operators of land that have PFAS on it liable? So there's sort of an unintentional redistribution and spread of PFAS contamination. And I think that's really true for farms. It's not intentional. It's just that when you move different crops around and you move manure around, that could unintentionally cause some more spread of this contamination, or it could end up with contamination going into places not planned for. And that might have impacts to other receptors like fish and wildlife or drinking water wells. So that makes the problem, really, really broad in scale. So how do we manage agriculturally generated waste streams? Those are questions we still need to get answered. What are safe levels for drinking water? That's still something we need to get answered. We're expecting some information from the EPA by the end of the year. And also, what are appropriate levels for PFAS in soils based on use and function? So we talked a little bit about residential remediation action guidelines, but that doesn't really answer some residential questions that people may have. Doesn't necessarily answer the questions based on food safety, which I'm sure Nancy will get into. But there are a lot of questions that still need to be answered and things that need to be considered as we move forward with PFAS and Maine. So with that, I just want to say thank you again for the opportunity to go over what the department is thinking about right now, and happy to answer any questions when it's appropriate.
Thank you. Does anyone have questions right out of the gate for Suzanne?
I do.
We get a copy of this
Yes.
sent to us.
Yeah.
This is
Member
Rick
Bennett?
Bennett. I have a couple questions.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the presentation. Just two kind of disconnected question. One is the $3.2 million for enhanced lab testing in Maine that was appropriated. You said that there were 2 awards there made, but can you give us more commentary on what capacity that's going to give us and over what time period? Particularly with respect to, is that sufficient? Do we have any better sense than we may have 6 months ago, whether that's a sufficient funding? And, very concerned about knowing the scope of the problem, and this testing issue is nationwide, and just anything you can add to that would be helpful. Well, and then I'll come back to my second question after.
So I'll do my best to answer that, Senator. There are 2 separate labs, both of which have a presence in Maine. One of which I believe is a lab in Maine, but it doesn't currently at this time have the equipment needed for PFAS to be analyzed in state. And both of them are very interested in having their labs actually be in Maine. I do think it's going to probably take about a year or so before they're up and running, so it's not going to happen quickly. In terms of their capacity, I don't know if there's a easy, I don't have the answer to that question. I can ask some more questions about that and follow up with you. But I do know that there were some very specific criteria that request for application to make sure that it would help not only state agencies keep up with their needs for getting information analyzed, but also so that residents in Maine will be able to submit their own samples within the state borders. I know that was a big concern that was raised by people who wanted to do their own, test their own water or their own property. And so I can try to get you an answer in terms of what that's going to look like in terms of number of samples or anything like that. I'm not sure if we have that information, but I will make a note to follow up on that.
Thank you. Understanding, getting the more information, the better for figuring out how to how to do our essential job here. The second question I had regarding your last slide, I think it was, where you talked about we're sort of waiting on EPA for more information. I mean, the EPA, as I understand, have their own advisory boards and their own academics. All that's available now, and I gather that the expectation is that EPA is going to say the acceptable level of PFAS in drinking water is going to be 0, and or thereabouts, and it's going to be, you know, an order of magnitude of 3 below where it is now. And so I just wondered, do we really need to wait on the formality of an EPA determination based, given the fact that the science in which they're going to make their decision is going to, it's probably going to lead in that direction, or do we expect something different to emerge?
I'll do my best to answer that one as well. I can't speak on behalf of the EPA. I'm not really sure what they're going to announce. But what I can say is that they are supposed to announce, a draft maximum contaminant level by the end of the year, or hopefully by the end of the year. And that will really help guide the state in evaluating what we should do in terms of our ongoing investigation. I don't know that it would be the best idea to switch a standard now and then have to switch back later. So we're trying to stay consistent with how we move forward. But we are taking this information very seriously and will, follow what is provided to us for guidance as we go forward with the program.
Okay, I'll just conclude by saying that the EPA might
better in terms of, deciding or determining what standards to be followed.
Yeah, I just wanted to editorialize and then I'll close my mouth. But the EPA has been wagging the dog on this, and I don't know if we should really be deferring to the EPA, where I think a lot of the problem is originated with the lack of attention to this issue to begin with, and I would not want to wait on their determinations when the science has already been established, and the science that will be guiding them is pretty much been established too. So, but thank you very much. I appreciate your presentation.
I'd like to ask a follow-up to that question. If we were to change our level, are the filtration systems that the DEP is putting into residences appropriate to reach the level that's recommended, that the EPA is suggesting we might?
So the filtration systems will work down to whatever the lab is able to detect. So whatever the detection level is, and that will vary a little bit by lab. But the thing to consider with that is that if you are having your filtration system work to a lower level, what it will ultimately mean is you'll have to replace the filters a little bit more frequently, which will increase the cost overall of all the filtration.
Question, and maybe it's not appropriate now, but I see all the waste streams where it travels and how to deal with it once it's in the waste stream. Is there any work being done to maybe not put it in the waste stream so that those of us who are at the end of that stream are not constantly having to figure out how to work around it?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so I didn't cover that in this presentation, but the department, well, first of all, the legislature passed legislation a couple of different times. There's a food packaging piece of legislation for 2019, and there's also from 2021 a product legislation for PFAS that's was put in place in 2021. And so the department is in the process of implementing both of those pieces of legislation. That's source reduction, basically trying to get PFAS out of the waste stream to begin with. So it has to do with product manufacturers first notifying the, what products they have, and what PFAS is in them, and how much, which particular compounds. And then ultimately the department will be over the next many years looking at all of that information and then developing some rules to decide where is PFAS really needed versus where is it just added. And so where it's actually needed or unavoidable, then there might be an exemption to keep it in those products, but if it's not, then it will be banned by 2030. In Maine.
But not over the bridge.
Correct.
So in the same vein of question is like sites like Unity Plantation, do they still have Like, are we still seeing waste come from other places, land there, and then being redistributed out of the state just for the purpose of composting the facility? Or is all that waste that's coming in, that can be a hard stop, because it's still coming into the state?
I'm not sure I'm following.
Are they bringing more sludge into Unity Plantation and places like that, composting it and trucking it out of the state? Or is it, do we have a hard stop on like bringing in contaminants like sludge from other places?
So that's a really complicated answer. So bringing, whether waste comes into the state or not is not something that the state can usually regulate due to the Commerce Clause, constitutional issues about waste coming in and out of state borders.
Mhm.
To the extent the state has been able to do that, there have been some really, I would say, and please forgive me, legislators, some wonky stuff we put into legislation to try to help us, maybe limit that. But I would say that it's really difficult to do that. So not sure that we can put a hard stop on sludge coming in, but let's assume it is in and it's coming in. Likewise, going back out of the state, I don't think we can really put a hard stop on that either, where it's a private business. Now, if you have something like a state-owned landfill, like Juniper Ridge, there's a little bit more control there. But where you have an entity that's a private business, that its business is waste, there's not really much the state can do in terms of regulating what comes in and what goes out.
And you had a breakdown of like Fairfield area and then everywhere else. Do you have it by county anywhere for us? So we would know where the hot spots are around the state, or is that information not packaged yet?
Yeah, I don't have that information yet. What I do have on our website is a list by community, like town name, and what number of what groundwater wells we found exceeding the state interim drinking water standard and groundwater wells that have not exceeded. So it's not quite as detailed as that, but it's green and red basically, and by town name, and then that information is also on the map. But if you're looking for a table, that's up there on the website, and it has this up through November as well.
Thank you.
I have a few questions. They're hopefully don't sound too disjointed, but just all kind of related to trying to think about appropriate ways for allocating funding. Just first off, like just kind of get a sense of scale. So you say you're almost done with tier 1, or you have completed it. How many farms? What did that end up being that you guys ended up testing into? Or I guess it would be well sites, I guess, not.
Yeah. So I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm going to throw a sort of a guesstimate out there, which is probably, let's say about 1,000 of those 1,185 are probably tier 1. And that's just a guess. And the reason I say that is because we just started tier 2. We officially started in August, but I think probably we didn't take our first samples till September. And with the way lab results are coming in, we're starting to trickle in now. So we're just starting to get some of that data. So that would be my guess. So the majority of those numbers come from tier 1.
And then is it possible for us to get a sense on, like when I'm thinking about, you're saying there's 2 grantees for labs, is it possible for us to get a sense of what the criteria, we said they have really strict criteria on what was expected of them. Is there a way for us to get access to what that criteria is to help us kind of decide, is that going to be adequate for the problem for more money?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a request for application. What I can do is pull up, there's a link through our state procurement website. And so I can pull up a link and provide it to Beth for distribution.
All right, if there aren't any additional questions, I'd love to keep moving on so we can stay on time. Anything else? Anyone online? Okay. I want to briefly mention the emergency relief fund that was created by the Farmland Trust and MOFCA, primarily from philanthropic money. And the goal was to have a much faster, more nimble response to PFAS for affected farmers. So that when they were in dire crisis and needing support, that money was there for them. The fund has been offering testing grants, income replacement grants. I'll email this out. I'll have Beth actually email this out to everybody. Hardship grants. So the hardship grants were specifically for folks who had lost substantial income prior to the from 2016 to 2021. So there were a handful of folks that were given one-time hardship grants. There's infrastructure grants for support with development of new or updated infrastructure for changing operations on farm, farmer wellness grants, and the testing program. There's been 70. I'll send this out. I don't want to walk through it verbally because I'm not sure there's a lot of utility in it currently, but I'll send it out to you all and we can dive into the specifics if folks are curious. But breakdown of the money, there's about $859,000 left in the fund. The two organizations raised $1.4 million total. And my understanding is that there will be some refund to the organization for some of the income replacement that was offered to farmers as we come up with our criteria for what here with our money. Any questions? And then we can move on to the Department of Ag.
Hey, everybody. I'm going to keep my remarks relatively high level for today to mostly give introductory overarching information, but no doubt I will be back or other members of my staff to really dive into this important area. So hopefully this will kick us off well today. Can we go to the next slide, please? So as some folks around the table may know, we here at the Department of Agriculture, and our bureau in particular, we are the primary folks who, from an agricultural perspective, are working to provide response to those in agriculture who face impacts of PFAS. Today, having learned a lot and come very far in the last 3+ years, the primary way in which farms are engaging with our department are through the tier process, which Suzanne just mentioned, or where they may have self-tested, they have called us and shared those results, and then we commence working with these producers to understand what's happening with those farms. So essentially what happens is DEP will share if it's a farm in the tier in that tiered situation, they will provide those results to us, but then we need to get to the farm and really do further and broader and more thorough investigation because PFAS is mobile, and just because there may have been historic sludge application in one area of the farm, we really need to understand how this may be impacting other areas of the farm. So we do pretty comprehensive step out investigation, which does take time. It depends on the time of year. And what we are able to understand are the operations and how that farm works. So our team will do and cover the cost of testing to determine the sources of exposure and what the levels of PFAS are. And as the slide says, we're testing everything from soil, water, fodder, compost, manure, if that's relevant, milk, and animal and vegetable tissue as well. And this is an iterative process. We are learning to be hopefully as comprehensive as possible. And it's not one and done. This continues throughout the growing season. And if there's ongoing monitoring that needs to happen, say we want to see if the milk is coming down, we will be testing on a every 2 weeks to monthly basis with a farm. It's very critical that we take these results and review them. We review them with our colleagues at CDC as well as with the producers to figure out what may be happening, what the explanation might be for the results, and determine potential mitigation at those sites. Overall, we are hopeful that we can reduce contamination at the farm level in order to produce safe products and allow these farms to remain viable. It is a very hard situation for these farms, and it is, we are very aware that the time that it takes to find these results is taking too long. For as we know, the labs are slammed in the New England and throughout the United States. So it's a very impactful time, to say the least, of working with these farms. Next slide, please. It's really important for everybody to understand that despite PFAS being found at a farm, not all farms are the same. Every farm is going to be different. And that's for a lot of variables. What are the crops that are being produced there? Where and what was the sludge applied? Everything can shift, even in a field, we will have variable results. So we try to caution people not to be too sweeping when they hear about farms and PFAS, because nuance and results matter. And that's why we do take all of those tests so seriously. As I mentioned, we actively coordinate with our sister agencies. And one of the things that we're doing, which I'll touch on another slide, is developing live animal tests for PFAS prior to slaughter in order to determine whether or not that animal may be safe for consumption. And I'll touch on that in greater detail in a moment. Over the past couple of years, we have worked in collaboration with a number of producer groups and educational groups, et cetera, including the University of Maine, Barber Extension, MAFCA, MFT, and others. I think we here in Maine have a really pretty amazing environment of people who want to help and bring their resources to bear. We have been building our team internally within the Bureau. This fall, we will now be up to 6 full-time employees. We just extended an offer to a GIS person who's going to help us with a lot of our visual technology, other data collection efforts. And we will move to likely 8 FTEs in 2023. Next slide, please. I want to give an example briefly of what might happen at a farm, going through that information collection process and working with a producer to see if we can make some progress. So we worked with a beef producer, a small beef producer that had contaminated water and soils from PFAS. We did that interview and collection with them. We found that there were low levels of PFAS in their pastures. Their hay field had higher levels of PFAS than was recommended. And their beef, which we tested, some freezer beef, which they had in their freezer, was above the existing action threshold of 3.4 parts per billion. We installed a water filter, we helped provide clean feed, and we discussed strategies on where those animals could graze and feed over time. It's interactive, that these animals have to move. There's just a lot of things that have to go into that management. So we're trying to learn as much as we can from the producer about that in order to, again, have strategies for the proper care and feeding of these animals. Ultimately, we wanted to see if this were working. So what happened was we are pioneering here in the state. We don't believe anyone else is doing this right now, to conduct live muscle biopsies on these animals in order to, and we will also take a blood serum samples at the same time, to take essentially a snapshot of what the PFAS is in those animals. And we then can see if the management recommendations are working out. As the bottom bullet states, in March, we conducted that biopsy, and the results were then compared with the final slaughter sample in May. We did not allow the processed meat to move until we had the results back, but it did show that between March and May that the animals' results dropped below the action threshold, and in most cases were not set. So while it is time consuming and not 100% perfect yet, we are finding that in fact the half-life for PFAS and beef, correct me if I'm wrong, about 2 months, Dr. Smith?
Depends on which PFAS.
Okay, PFOS.
Some are pretty short.
Yeah, so pretty short.
longer.
So from the point of non-exposure,
Time to take to come down by half. So if you can interrupt the exposure pathway for PFAS, for the 8 and 10 ones, it's about 70 days or so. But for some of them, it's only like 2 weeks. And for others of them, like PFOA, you can't even get the buildup in the muscle tissue to begin under incredibly high water concentrations.
You're
quite
saying just
different.
muscle, right? Like not like fat,
Muscle,
not fat tissue. So
Yeah.
like, especially if you're having cut meat or something.
yeah, we don't see big variation between cuts, so far.
Next slide, please. So, in the last year or so, and with the support of the legislature providing us with funding, we have been able to craft some financial assistance mechanisms. This slide I briefly walked through. And no doubt we'll be diving into these in greater detail moving forward from here. We first started out by creating a testing reimbursement at the beginning of the DEP's tier investigation. A number of farms were very interested in self-testing. And so we were able to reimburse those producers who self-tested. The criteria is that they do need to share that with us in order to be reimbursed. And if they happen to work with a third party to do that, we will pay for those consulting fees or contractor fees. As Suzanne mentioned, there are water filters that are being put on at residentials, likewise, residences, likewise for farms, where the water for their operations are above 20 parts per trillion. We will work with a third party to right size the water filtration system and get that installed. That payment will also cover yearly maintenance and testing and replacement parts. The infrastructure investment is one area that we are able to assess. Criteria basically for any of these are that there are results that show exceedances of PFAS, and that we are working with the farms so that we really understand what they're doing and how they're responding, and we can then assess how we can help support any infrastructure investment that they might request. So some examples that we have supported include winterizing a barn room for water filtration. We reimbursed for equipment purchases that allowed for alternative crops to be harvested. We funded a raised bed project and a greenhouse project. We've also provided clean hay. And we have a number of other requests in the pipeline. We've supported 6 farms to date for about $331,000. And no doubt we'll continue to receive requests for assistance. This is something that as a bureau, we would like to continue to do. I know that we aren't instantaneous in being able to provide the support, but because we are on the ground, so to speak, with these farms, we have staff that know these farms well. We would like to continue to use some of our funding going forward to more quickly respond to infrastructure investments. So let's just put a pin in that for this fund, so that if there are bigger, broader, larger infrastructure investments that are proposed at a farm, perhaps we could think about criteria where that would come to you all, and we can be the ones talking about feed assistance and that kind of thing. But I just want to put that out there as food for thought. We really do appreciate our ability to help here where we can. For income replacement, the intention here is to compensate farms for the loss of income that they suffer when PFAS contamination either causes them to cease all production or most production. Right now, we constructed this so that we would pay up to 1 year of the prior year's gross income. Although there are adjustments on what that gross income tally would be. And if they are able to continue to have some sales and have also received some outside support for PFAS, we take that out in order to determine what that payment will be. I want to mention that both MOPCA and MFT have been strong supporters for farms in both infrastructure investment and income replacement. We have tried to be as harmonized with them as best as we can, so that because they can act more swiftly than we can, they have put money forward for farms, which we then reimburse. And just something Senator Brenner mentioned that as well. So I just want to be very clear that where MOPCA and MFT have provided initial funding, we have tried to provide that, reimburse that. And the producers who are involved in that calculus understand that going into it.
And last, we have a livestock indemnification assistance program. Essentially, we view this as the last line, unfortunately, for a producer if their livestock really do present very high levels of PFAS, where we think depuration will be unlikely to occur quickly. There are financial costs and other constraints really impeding the farm from making that happen. We will assist with the depopulation of those animals, and we will do that for the producer, and then we will pay them the value of the animals that were depopulated. Thus far, we have supported 2 farms in this effort and provided approximately $250,000 in payments for folks. And I should have mentioned for income replacement, 3 farms have been supported, and at least 4 more are in the pipeline. We have provided $512,000 to date, and there's likely another $500,000 in the pipeline for those farms that have not yet gone through the tally process. So I think that's all I have on that slide. That was a lot. Just very briefly, I wanted to flag, and we can talk about this at another time, that we all know that this is not a main issue. Maine just happens to be out front and working on this. And what's pretty remarkable is that we've made a lot of headway in talking about our process and our learnings and our experience and our data to date at the federal, national, and even international level. We are in consistent touch with our federal delegation in Washington, D.C. We also speak with our colleagues at USDA, FDA, EPA, and I do think we're starting to get a little bit more traction now than we have in the past. We're also actively engaging with national groups. NASA is the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, and ECOS is the Environmental Council of States. Thank you. And just last week, I met both with Michigan and some folks in Australia to talk about what we're doing. So we're not in this by ourselves, which is better than the alternatives. So with that, I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions that people may have. It's fine.
Any questions for the director? Senator Bennett?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe this is a better question for the research side of the agenda, but you use the term half-life with respect to organisms and PFAS maintaining in these organisms. It's kind of an inapt term, I think, because half-life usually relates to the breaking down of the material, and I'm not sure that the material is breaking down and maybe just leaving the organism. And I just wondered if you could, again, defer happily if this is a little too wonkish, but I hear this term in the press. I'm not sure it's helpful. I certainly not helpful to me, and could you explain what that means exactly?
I'd be happy to defer.
Good afternoon, Senator Bennett. When we use the term half-life, it's to refer to how long it takes to achieve 1/2 the concentration that is currently in something once you stop exposure. So if you think of cow beef, for example, once we stop or interrupt the intake of contaminated feed and water, how long will it take for that muscle tissue level to decrease by 1/2? And that is, in the case, we already talked about, that's an example of something on the order of, a couple of months for some of them, a couple of weeks for others. It's a common useful metric that we use in thinking about how persistent these chemicals are. Unfortunately, in human bodies, it's more like 1 to 2 to 4 years is the half-life, compared to months for a cow, compared to days for chicken eggs. So it's quite variable depending on what species you're talking about and what compartment within that species. Does that help with understanding better how we use that terminology?
Yes, and particularly when we're talking about agricultural products, though, we're, I know that eggs are kind of a basic thing, it's either in the egg or not. We don't really maybe care about the chicken if we're not eating the chicken, but like a cow, there are different kinds of meats and different kinds of parts of the cow. And I just wonder, is that just a generalized term for the entire organism? And a follow-up, probably not necessary to deal with now, but it's just the research that's involved with why the material is decreasing in some organisms at a different rate than others. Two separate questions there, one of which you can defer. I know it's probably not appropriate for now, but the other one, I'm just curious how you're measuring.
For example, with beef animals, so you're usually what it's going to mean is serial time points. Serial meaning repeated measuring of the same animal over time is the best way to get at that. And how is it changing and how fast is it changing? And then sometimes you have to be testing at the front end, meaning what's coming into the animal to make sure that you truly have interrupted exposure from water and feed. So you're measuring that, and then you're measuring changes, which is why the innovative work that Nancy's team, their assistant state veterinarians are doing with live animal tissue biopsies that allows you to do repeat measures on the same animal, or they're collecting serum measures from the animal. So we can watch and measure that over time, a bit easier than getting the surgical beef sample, especially from cows. So there's that kind of a study we're doing to get at your question about what's happening. I think you're right that in most cases what's happening is we're just moving it from the animal to someplace else. It's not that we're breaking down PFAS per se. We're just eliminating it from the animal either through feces or through milk, through urine, depending on which PFAS we're talking about. So then it becomes a manure issue or some other issue to tackle.
Thank you very much.
Back to the first presentation.
Any other questions for the director?
So I want to review what the law says the fund may be used for with regard to farmer assistance. If you'll keep scrolling, please, John. Next one. Okay, stop there, please. So according to the statute that established the PFAS fund, funds can be used for things like relocating a farm, buying and selling land, purchasing equipment, facilities and infrastructure, developing enterprise budgets, and replacing income and making mortgage payments. So there's a lot of similarities there between what the Bureau is presently doing and what the fund could take on. Will you please scroll to next? So now I want to open it up to discussion. Where do we begin? Knowing that there is an existing safety net both through the Bureau and through Maine Farmland Trust and MOPCA, which are fantastic given how quickly they've been stood up. But we have an opportunity to take those further to address issues that aren't presently being adequately addressed. The one item that isn't being addressed presently in particular is land purchases and relocation of farms. So yeah, with that, who wants to, what are the most pressing needs just related to farmer assistance? We'll get onto other topics as this meeting continues.
The department must have some ideas.
I actually would love to hear from the farmers themselves. I think that would be a good place to start.
How many farms are currently affected, I guess, on one level or another?
Sure, I can answer that. We have approximately 45 farms that have been identified through the tier process as well as through self-reporting. That does not include 3 farms that have ceased production entirely, that somewhat predate the tier process. And yet, the caveat, 45 farms, various levels of PFAS, various levels of impact, but those have been forwarded to us, and we have some level of engagement with all of them to investigate them and go through that process.
And of those, how many of them have both the issue of soil and water, or just one or the other? Does it seem to be that
That's a
they
great
either have
question.
both or not?
I can answer that question, not right now, but we have that data. I don't want to speculate, but oftentimes it's both.
And this, we have a lot of questions for direction. I guess, so when you say 45 farms, I think the big question I have is like, I think it's great that DACF is into like holding on to this infrastructure component. I'm just curious, is that all being funded ultimately through that initial block of money that came to DACF? And as far as like, if you spent like over 300,000 at this point, looks like on infrastructure. And that's on like 6 farms. There's 45 farms that have been identified that you're actively working on. And like, frankly, that's like people that are willing to work with you too, right? Do you foresee long-term, like, I'm kind of curious about where DACF's ability and maybe this fund's ability to support infrastructure is going to like land, you know, because there's short-term infrastructure support, which does seem like that makes a lot of sense. And then there's also the longer-term investment. And this kind of goes to Jim's point of like the type of contamination, whether we're talking about a farm that once they get clean water, they may be able to function as normal or closer to normal, or a farm that's like got it in their soil and it's going to be a lifetime project. And so just kind of curious where that line is going to be and any feedback you have on like, just kind of thinking about the fund in general, like what your thoughts are on that.
Those are all excellent questions, Adrian. And I think that line is continues to evolve.
Yeah.
So our bureau has a set amount of funding, and we're watching that, and it may be finite, right? It really depends on how things progress with legislative support, et cetera. But we certainly want to use it to the best of our abilities while we can, based on the knowledge that we have. Great point about, you know, some farms are going to be able, more so than others, to make some sort of investment and move forward. Others, it will be more time intensive. It will take more than that. We have created a cap right now on infrastructure investment of about $150,000 at a farm, mostly around the area of equipment or permanent physical assets. We haven't put a cap on, say, feed or something like that, but we do want to be mindful of what does it need to be fully supportive of a farm, and when should that be somewhat when does that taper off, right? Is the farm seeing positive results? Are they instituting the management advice that we're all coming up to together? We want to be mindful of this because this is taxpayer dollars. And so I think there does need to be some parameters put around. I don't necessarily have them. We don't necessarily have them all right now. But these are things that even if it were to shift, or in any program that this advisory committee comes up with, does need to think about for thresholds or criteria or timeframes, because they're, like you said, could be farms that really want to succeed, but it might be multi-year, multi-hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of investments, and how do you make that decision?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think this is something that might evolve over time. And we've talked about it, Nancy. Right now, the options we have are to help people try to figure out how to move forward. When we get to the point where we have a buyback program or, you know, farm buyout program, it may be that, you know, looking down the road at the level of contamination, there might be an answer as to whether or not that's the right way to go versus trying to put money into, you know, moving forward on that land. But right now we don't have that. And so, you know, I think our goal is just to try to do everything we can to help people move forward.
No. Anyone online? Could either of you speak to any of the thinking or strategy around what a buyback program would look like?
Yes. First, we're really excited that this legislation allows for it. We know that there have been farms that have wanted to cease production and move on. And so to allow someone the ability to make that decision and know that there will be a framework put into place is really pretty impactful. We also know that hopefully one day we might have mitigation and technology strategies that allow for that farmland to once again become usable safely. So we think that there needs to be a robust ability to assess a property, but be mindful that PFAS may not technically be forever, if you will, at that farm. So that's a challenge. How do you gauge what the losses are today, 2022, 2023 for a farm, and all the inherent things that go into assessing real estate, which I do not have the capacity to do. Is it still but for PFAS prime farmland and that type of thing? So assessment has to be really key. Then there needs to be some sort of thought about who's taking on and in what way does this land become sort of banked? Does the department or some other entity hold this land, and in what capacity do we how do we structure that? Who monitors it? Who make sure that nothing is happening to it while it's out of production, et cetera. So to answer your question, we certainly have some thoughts, but not a lot of clear thinking in terms of what it might look like.
And the intent is for the programs that you've currently developed to move over and be administered financially under this fund.
Yes and no. I think the depopulation payments, for instance, water filtration. Again, as long as we have the funding to do that, we're happy to continue to do that. I think it's important that we do that. I'm happy for us to continue while we can with infrastructure viability, we call it the viability fund, to help farms as quickly as we can to pivot or buy that piece of equipment or winterize XYZ. But depending on scale, if someone wants to get out of dairy and become a beef producer, maybe that's a bigger, longer, heftier vision that could come to this. And then income replacement, I do think that there's a role for this group to take that on. We've learned a lot. It's not a perfect system. I'm sure it can be improved. Happy to go through what has worked and what hasn't. But really do believe that there's a place for, it's also been very, very time intensive. So yeah, I think the income replacement could come over.
Another, just a clarification question, actually. I mean, maybe I just haven't done my homework well enough. Just needing clarity on, so there's like the stuff that will like say that these are things that we moved over to the advisory committee. Do we then as a group set up or are hiring additional staff to manage those decisions? Or is that could ultimately go back to DACF to have more staff to do that? I guess I'm unclear on like where that line is.
Yeah,
you
so
know?
the fund is, it's not in the bureau.
It's not at all.
No, it's administered out of the commissioner's office. So
Okay.
Beth is the director of the fund. And so anything that gets moved into the fund,
Yeah.
yes, there could come a point where we need additional staff. We likely will need additional staff to stand up all these different programs and to run them. So that's, you know, those those are things that we can sort out on the back end. I think it's just a matter of figuring out where is the most logical place for these programs to live.
But then as far as like, how, like what I think about is like the DACF's ability to like have staff that with the agricultural background to like navigate these decisions. And so ultimately thinking about more broadly how this fund would need to be used, like obviously you're in charge of allocating this, but then like, it seems like just from my experience as a farmer that has been working with the DACF on this, that like, you know, for all their own, like there could be double the amount of staff just to be able to probably support the people that you are supporting. So just kind of curious if you know, some of these programs are being administered, or these programs or whatever it does end up being administered through this fund, it just seems like curious how we're going to navigate just to be managing all of that.
And that's why we're coming up with a plan.
Yeah.
Just to get at those issues. And so, and at this point, this very early point, I see this advisory committee helping us to establish the criteria for what sorts of projects get funded, but not necessarily being involved in every decision. This, you know, Farm A get X amount of dollars.
For sure.
And I also envision continuing to work very closely with the Bureau because they do have the experts over there who have the ability to visit the farms and do the serial testing, you know, build those relationships so they can make referrals to the funds. Right. So here's this project. This is the criteria that we developed as a group. It's in the plan. And then this particular farm has these needs that are in line with the plan, and therefore we can write a chapter. So again, it's early days, but that's how I'm thinking this will play out.
Thanks for that clarity.
Yes.
Do you think there's a way to, like, there's sort of a open end of this where it's like, we know how many farms in theory there are, and they can make the choice to do what they want to do, but is there any way to like contact every farm and ask, like, do you want this done? And we need this all done by September of 2025. So that there's like, raise your hand now, or, you know, there's a problem here of like, when will it end and when do things, you know, $60 million is not a ton of cash over 10 years, you think of it, or 20 years. And what happens in 30 years? What would be like the idea in 30 years that someone buys, say, an old farm from someone, and then it's like, well, I'm going to do my due diligence and pull some water tests, and oh my God, it's worse than I thought, because the last landowner said, I don't really care, whatever it is. Do we like have an idea of contacting every farm and asking their preference of what they'd like to do, or, you know?
That's an interesting point. You guys, well,
Well, I mean, it doesn't directly answer your question, but when we are doing our sampling, we are reaching out to every landowner to get permission to do the sampling on the property, soil and water testing, and some of them have denied access. That goes for residences too, I'd say on average. And again, this is just an estimate, but I just am looking at some of the numbers, probably about 10% or so, just they either don't call back, they don't want to do the DP, they don't want, you know, involvement.
I also think, yeah, there's a spectrum, right? There are a number of folks who self-tested and really, you know, made that decision to go and find that out for themselves. And there are others out there who really don't want to know. They're going to wait until they're contacted. And there's only so much with our resources that we can do right now in order to be as helpful as possible. To your point, though, to collect information and to gather input and feedback from people about priorities, et cetera. No doubt we could do that and survey that. So that's a good idea.
I'll make two comments to your question. One is just around the fund and its life, and sort of the idea of replenishment of the fund. The AG's office has hired an outside firm to pursue class action lawsuit proceedings, of which would in theory help with some of the fund's responsibilities long term. And then you know, the sort of other issue around properties changing hands. There might at some point be a reason to have a discussion about disclosure
Mhm. Yeah.
for real estate transfer.
Thank
I think this is a robust conversation, but I do know that you have a hard deadline of leaving us this afternoon. So I'd like-
I changed it.
well,
I'm
thank you for that.
here all evening.
So why don't we go ahead and move right into Dr. Smith's presentation. Thank you.
And is that good for our folks online? So I get a thumb up. Is that? Oh, well, it should be largely. Okay, good. Okay, so now we're going to switch topics. Beth, do you want to give any entry beginning comments about the context here with the fund, or just wanting to launch into it?
I can just say broadly that the fund gives us, or we have broad discretion to spend the fund on blood monitoring, blood testing, medical monitoring, and healthcare. And those terms aren't really defined. And I think what Dr. Smith is going to talk about today is the nuances, monitoring for what purpose, how effective are blood testing, is there uniformity? And yeah, I'll let you
Okay.
fill in all the details.
All right, so let's just jump right to the next slide, please. Can you hide your notes? I thought the notes were gone, so I don't know which version you have, but yes. Oh, okay, yeah, can you move in, what do you do, just make a PDF of the talk? Or?
Yeah, I don't know what's going on.
With the PowerPoint, just make sure you're in screen view. I mean, show view.
It's been transferred to a Google Drive, which is how we're able to share it.
Okay, so can you move into slideshow mode? And maybe that will get rid of them. How's that? Better?
I think that looks,
Thank you.
Yeah, looks good, Andy.
Okay, great. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so I've got 3 topics I want to go over in the next, 15, 18 minutes or so. I'm going to spend a lot of time on the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine report. This is the one that just came out in July. It's the one that we asked the legislature to let us wait to see what the results were, so that rather than give a mandate to do a blood testing program, it's like, let's see what they have to say, then think about where we go from there. So I'm really going to spend most of my talk on what we have learned from them based on their report. And then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about what we've learned anecdotally about the accessibility and reliability of PFAS blood testing here in Maine now. And then I'll end with teeing up hopefully some considerations for you all to think about as you think about possibly establishing a blood testing program in Maine. Next slide, please. A little bit about the National Academy of Sciences for those of you who are not familiar with it. It actually dates back to 1863, was signed into Congress by President Lincoln, and established this sort of non-governmental, non-partisan scientific group to advise the nation on matters of science and technology in the 60s and 70s, the 1960s and 1970s. They're adding an Academy of Engineering and Academy of Medicine, and these 3 academies, which is why it's plural, work together sometimes on commission reports. And in this case, we have the U.S. Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, sorry for all the names, which is part of federal CDC, and the National Institute for Environmental Health Studies, coming together and asking the National Academy to undertake this report of looking at guidance on PFAS exposure, blood testing, and clinical follow-up, so that they can update their 2019 document which provides the current clinical guidance to physicians in this area. And what the NES has provided us is really four things. So the one thing is they've given us their take on the strength of evidence for various health conditions associated with PFAS. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then they give us these recommendations. When clinicians should offer a blood test, number one. Number two, what sort of health monitoring should be done to people based on what their blood test result is. We'll talk a little bit about that. They've also given us some sense of frequency of repeat testing for people that have elevated levels. We'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide, please. So 2 slides on health effects. The NAS, looking at it, they went through a process, and really I should step back a little bit more about their overall process that they're using. So these are individuals who are considered experts in their field. That's how they get on the national academies, and they bring together a group specific for writing this report. And what they're going to do is they're going to hold public hearings so they can get public input and hear from community activists dealing with contamination. They're going to hear from technical experts coming and testifying before them. They're going to review the various sort of compilations that authoritative agencies, both in the US and outside, have put together in thinking about health effects of PFAS and testing, et cetera. And then they're going to do a literature search of what's happened since the last of these reports came out and review that literature. All that goes into them coming up with what their recommendations and draft report is. They then submit that for an independent peer review. Then it's finalized, then we get to see what they said. So what you're going to hear is what came out of that whole process that they went through. So again, on the health effects side, they broke them into 2 sort of categories for the most part. One is where they consider that the evidence is sufficient that there's an association between PFAS exposure and a health effect, which means they think there's a good chance, or they think there's little chance that it's due to bias in the studies or just a chance finding, which is something we're always worried about with health studies with real people because it's complicated. And it's 4 health effects they focused on that meet that criteria. Decreased antibody response following either infections or vaccines. Think of that as a marker of an effect on our immune system. Not necessarily a adverse effect, but clearly an effect on the immune system, which may influence how well you respond to illness. Dyslipidemia, that's just abnormal cholesterol and fat levels in your blood. That is an health effect for which there is robust evidence. Decreased infant and fetal growth. These are sort of small changes in body weight at birth or things like that. That was a robust finding. And this increased risk of kidney cancer, mostly associated with the PFAS we talked before. 8 carbons, carboxylic acid groups, and the end if you care about that sort of stuff. But those are the ones they found the most robust effort for. Next slide. Then there was another group of about 6 health outcomes, which they thought there was limited suggestive evidence. So in this case, they can't quite rule out that the finding could be due to bias in the studies or chance, but there's enough evidence, suggestive evidence, that they're putting it in this list. So increased risk of 2 types of cancer, breast and testicular, increase of pregnancy-induced hypertension, so high blood pressure, and then the more severe type of pregnancy-induced hypertension called preeclampsia. So now you have organs, systems involved in addition to high blood pressure. Thyroid disease and dysfunction, increased risk of ulcerative colitis, that's an autoimmune disease, and then liver enzyme alterations. The point I would like you to take from these is not so much what the list is at this point of time, because the Academy recognizes this is an area of emerging science. We're learning a lot all the time. New papers are coming out. They specifically recommended every 2 years this should be updated as we learn more about what health effects. But importantly, what they're doing with this list of health effects is they're going to use that to think about what health monitoring should happen. That's what I'd like you to take from. These are the health effects they have the most confidence in for the current health studies. They're going to use that to think about what health monitoring should be going on at this time. Next slide, please. Now, the next 3 slides are going to talk about how they went through their process of thinking about a recommendation around blood testing. So they're going to think about the benefits of blood testing. They're going to think about the potential harm of blood testing, and they're going to think about what the limitations of information you can get from blood testing. So starting with the benefits, If you, one is you're going to get increased awareness of your exposure so that exposure can be reduced. So what your body is doing and what the blood compartment does for you is it integrates all these exposure pathways you're getting, whether it's from water, whether it's from food you eat, whether it's incidental soil ingestion or game or whatever, all that's coming in and it's building up or not building up, but it's going to be in your blood. You measure your blood, you get an overall estimate of what your exposure is. That's the real value that it can do. And knowing that, you can then think about whether or not the efforts you're taking to reduce that are working, because you can then monitor that over time. And you're looking to see, are those levels decreasing in concordance with what we would expect, given what we know about how persistent these chemicals are in our body once you shut down exposure. So if you eliminate exposure, for some of these, the half-life, sorry to use that term again, Senator Bennett, but the half-life is going to be on the order of 1 to 4 years. For some of them, it's a matter of weeks. For some of them, days, but for some of them, even longer. So it really depends on which PFAS you're talking about, of which there are hundreds, but we tend to focus mostly right now on about 14 or 16, which one of those are, and they will each have their own half-life in our body. So those are two benefits you get out of it. You get the benefit of identification of potential health condition, inform preventative care. So the blood serum level in many ways is your gateway to thinking about health effects, because most of the health studies are using blood serum levels as their marker of exposure. So if you're reading these publications or other people are trying to look at health effects, they're often doing the studies with a measure of exposure, which is human serum levels. So if you know that your own serum level, it gives you access, or your doctor access, to this growing body of information. So that's a benefit of it. The committee really took, I think, considerable effort to the committee, right? Took considerable effort to hear from local communities and activists involved in responding to PFAS contamination. And I think they really listened to that. And that's why you see some of these last two benefits of, what a blood test can do is help empower both communities and individuals and thinking about their exposure, acting on their exposure, and becoming more involved in managing that exposure. And that's something they heard repeatedly in their public hearings and weighed on them in thinking about their recommendations around blood testing. And then it may relieve the stress of not knowing one's exposure. You'll see on the next slide, it may also cause stress from knowing your exposure. But if you play both ways, next slide, please. On the harm side, there's the fear of having a blood draw, depending on who you are. That can be something that can be really, I think, concerning to people. There's a small risk of injury and infection at the actual draw site. So this is just the academy thinking through what are the potential harms of blood testing. There's a difficulty interpreting the results. So if any of you have actually received results, they are not easy to understand, especially the way the laboratories report them. I've done a number of consults with people to try to help them understand the results, done webinar with clinicians to try to help them understand their results and think about those results. So I think that's a real legitimate concern, is making sure if you're going to collect that information and provide that information, you're providing it in a way that people can understand. As I mentioned, knowing what your blood levels are, especially if they're high, that's going to be of stress and concern for people, understandably. And you're balancing against that the benefit of them knowing and being able to act on it. There's clinical consequences for medical follow-up as a result of having your blood test. Committee didn't exactly explain that one and what it is. We think what they're getting at is if you have a blood test and you decide to do further medical follow-up, there will be attendant risks of harm associated with some of those, depending on what they are. Not positive about that, but we think that's what they were getting at here. Next slide, please. And then finally, it's important to understand what a blood test will tell you and what it won't tell you. Right? So I've told you what it will tell you. It's a really good estimate of what your exposure is in the recent past years. The longer you move away from your exposure ending, the less helpful a blood test becomes, because it's not telling you what you used to be exposed to. So as our body eliminates it, that's going to be reflected in your blood. And then therefore that becomes of less value the further you move away from once you're on clean water or whatever else is interrupting your exposure. So that's a limitation of it. It's also not going to tell you what your source of exposure is. So it's going to tell you your total exposure, and that's very valuable, but it's not going to tell you how much of that is water, how much of that is food, how much of that is incidental soil ingestion. You have to get that from other means or other types of studies. It's not going to predict or rule out whether any individual will get a certain health problem. It's not what a blood test does. Just like if I get a cholesterol test, it's not going to tell me whether I'm going to get a heart attack. Will it tell me I'm at increased risk of heart attack? Yes. It will tell me something about heart attack. And it will also not indicate whether a current illness is a result of past or current exposure. It may tell you, again, you're at increased risk, but it won't answer the question if you're someone with kidney cancer and you get a blood test, does that prove that you're that it will be better or not? It's not, but it's capable of doing it. Next one. So now that you have sense of the benefits, a sense of the limitations, and a sense of the harm. Next slide, please. Nope, that's good. This is where the committee landed. So they came out with a very clear recommendation. Clinicians should offer PFAS blood testing to patients who are likely to have a history of elevated exposure. I'm going to talk in the next slide just about this, what they mean by history of elevated exposure. What I want you to take right now is that this is a change of the current recommendation. So if you read the current ATSDR guidance to clinicians or some of the other guidance out there, they're at best neutral, if not actively discouraging blood testing. That's what's currently out there. So this is a significant change in recommendations. They also, I think, made a real point of emphasizing they believe the decision of blood testing should be a shared decision between the patient and their clinician. It's the way it's best done. And you'll see in a moment why that's an important distinction to make. So next slide, please. So now to this issue of what do they mean by a history of elevated exposure? They gave an example of occupational exposure to PFAS. And they said, you know, it's examples, people working with fluorochemicals and potentially firefighters. What they did not mention, but I would add, would be farming. That's a form of occupational exposure through contact with soils, etc. So you can imagine that being a reason to want to consider getting a blood test potentially. Then this lived in communities with documented PFAS contamination, lived in areas where PFAS contamination may have occurred. They are pretty vague and pretty highly generalized. And they didn't provide a lot more specificity in the report as to what that means. Our thinking is what we think they're assuming will happen is for any individual, this is where there will be that shared decision-making with a provider to sort of review what their exposure history may be. Maybe they have a water test, some other sort of information, and then use that to make a decision together on whether to get a blood test or not. Next slide, please. So busy slide here. I don't want to spend a lot of time getting into the details. What I want to call your attention to are a couple of things about their recommendations of the health monitor. First, they're linked to blood level. So you get your blood level test, depending on what there's some variation in what the recommended health monitoring is. The next thing I'd like you to take from that is they've, I think, gone to great lengths to try to make the health monitoring align with current standard of care for doing medical monitoring of some of these health effects that are associated with PFAS, but that also have other risk factors, right? So there is a standard of care for monitoring for lipid disorders. There is a standard of care for monitoring high blood pressure during pregnancy. There is a standard of care for screening for breast cancer, right? So what they're saying is treat PFAS as another risk factor for these things and make sure in that annual physical, these things are happening. And then for the blood levels, they're putting them in a category where if you're above 20 nanogram per ml, that won't mean anything to you yet. But if you're above that number, you do more. If you're between 2 and 20, that's a level where they're thinking it's not clear that there's necessarily a health effect, but it's clear that there's elevated exposure, there's an opportunity to reduce exposure. So we should both screen and be focusing on exposure reduction. If you're above 20, then at that point, you're now at an increased risk of possible health effects. Add a bit more onto that ongoing screening or ongoing health monitoring by looking at things like thyroid dysfunction, signs and symptoms of kidney cancer once you're 45 years and older, or signs of testicular cancer or ulcerative colitis. And those last three are ones they borrowed from a health monitoring program set up for the C8 study, if any of you are familiar with that. So this is the West Virginia, Ohio area with the contaminated wells, quite highly contaminated wells. And part of a court order was to set up a health monitoring program. So they borrowed from that information for coming up. So the thing is, there is now specific guidance for health monitoring to be done on an ongoing basis with people based on the results of the blood test result. Next slide. So where does that leave us right now in terms of what they've given us? They've given us their sense of what the health effects are. So that's added and with a weight of evidence. They've given recommendations as to when clinicians should offer blood testing, recommendations for health monitoring, fairly specific. And they've even given us frequency of repeat testing for PFAS. I didn't mention that, but for the longer, the ones with longer half-lives, they're saying it doesn't make sense to test much more often than every year. That would be often enough for those. So that's what they've given us so far. It's important to recognize who they've given this to. This is a public document, but their responsibility was to give this information to the U.S. Agency Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which will now take it to update their 2019 clinical guidance for physicians. We assume they're working on it. We don't know what the timeline is for that, but this is out there now as well to be looked at and seen. Next slide. So now, last two slides. We've spent one talking about what we know of what we've learned about PFAS blood testing made, and then I'll tee up some considerations for you. So in terms of what we've learned about PFAS blood testing in Maine, it's possible to give a blood test. There's a Pennsylvania-based laboratory called NMS Labs, which Quest Diagnostic Services. Quest is a big national diagnostic testing service. So they have worked out a contract with NMS Labs that if you give them a serum sample, they will analyze it for PFAS. The list costs about $450. And then there's the blood draw cost as well. So I've heard estimates of $600 to $700 to get the whole thing done. Anecdotally, we're hearing that some health insurers will pay for the test, some may not, and deductibles may come into play. So if you have a high deductible, even though your insurance might pay for these sorts of things, you still might have to pay that full $600 if you haven't met your deductible yet. So that's variable in terms of what we've heard back from people that have contacted us, and we usually ask them whether insurance paid for their test or not. You should be aware that the currently available NMS test is limited. Currently only looking at 6 PFAS, fortunately, most of them are the ones we're most interested in, but only 6, and only certain structural forms of the PFAS. We sometimes refer to the PFAS as linear isomers. So think of a long carbon chain, they're all in a nice line, like a tree trunk, that's linear. If you all of a sudden have some of the carbons, same number of carbons, but they're coming off that chain, that's branched. Well, they're only quantifying the linear isomers. Whereas we know from water sampling and some beef sampling, there are some branched isomers for like PFAS that are out there. They're not currently getting that. But two things. Number one, NMS is saying that perhaps as early as the end of this month, they will have the ability to provide both linear and branched. And perhaps like early as the end of the month, they'll be offering a test with now a panel of, I think I put 14, I think it's 16 individual PFAS. And they will be using CDC's methodology that they use for the National Biomarker. So I think very soon we'll be in a place where much more state-of-the-art testing capacity available to clinicians for PFAS and serum. The other thing I'll just quickly note is working with Maine General Medical Center, we've been engaged in a study to look at the current test and how well it performs against CDC methodology. And the good news, it actually performs quite well. So when we match up people and people with PFAS and PFAS and the other ones, and look at the relationship between the NMS test result and the CDC methodology, they actually look quite good. And where they don't, it's where we would expect them to not, right? If they're missing branch isomers, one's going to be slightly lower than the other. If something is really got a short half-life, like PFHPA, the 7-carbon analog of PFOA, you're going to see big differences if you have a 1 to 6 month time difference between the two sample points, because that chemical happens to be eliminated much faster than some of the others. So the other thing I'll just mention here is there is now available a home test kit for PFAS. So people can go on web to Empower DX and order a test kit. It'll arrive, you'll do a finger prick on a piece of paper, mail it back. A month later, you will get a result for 44 different PFAS for a cost of $599. So that's out there, that's there. The National Academies was aware that this was out there. They pointed out that there's uncertainty in taking a capillary whole blood sample result and trying to interpret relative to a venous blood serum result, which is what most of the human health studies are based on and what is typically done. And I think they also had a bias towards that really should be something happening, again, between a clinician and an individual as opposed to people just doing it. But it is out there and it is available. So you should be aware of that. Last slide. So now just tee up a few considerations for you that have occurred to us when it comes to establishing blood testing health monitoring program. First one is whether or not this program can be just solely healthcare based. So if there already is, or it will soon be, a robust test for measuring serum level that a clinician can order, then is there a need to do anything more for that? And if there are recommendations for health monitoring, that is what a clinician can do with the annual physical, is there a need to do anything more? But we do need to think, are there barriers to accessing the NMS test for providers? As I mentioned right now, Quest Diagnostic has worked out a contractual mechanism for the NMS test. I'm not sure Nordics has, and some of the other ones. So if I'm a provider working at a hospital system that relies on Nordics, the question is, can I easily get that test as well? And if not, what needs to be done to modify that, to make it easier for the providers to actually order and get that test for their patients. Then there's the question of who pays the cost of a blood test for the underinsured or uninsured. Underinsured would be people with a high deductible or whatever reason their insurance may not. And there the question is, do we need anything like what New Hampshire has done, where they've established a mandate that insurance must pay for PFAS blood tests? So that's a question, that you may want to consider and think about. Then there's the question of whether or not results of blood testing should be reportable to the state. And I bring this up because the Academy actually recommended that they should. But if they are reported to us, what is our obligation to act on that data? Are we to apply toxicology consults to individuals? Are we, or we just to collect it and do analyses of what we see, etc. And I think that's just something we're going to want to think about. And if it becomes, ongoing consults, what we will need for resources to do that. Like I said, I've probably done a half a dozen to a dozen of those now, but that's very feasible when it's a dozen. If it's hundreds a year, then it's something different that we have to think through. And then I think the last one for you to think about is, so is there a role for the state of Maine in providing blood testing services? Perhaps the uninsured or the underinsured? That's a question. There is funding to set up a PFAS testing laboratory at the state public health laboratory. What has not been decided yet is what that laboratory will test, what medium. Because there's some real needs for testing services. Agriculture has important needs for timely testing. An animal carcass is waiting in the slaughter, and you've got to tell someone you've got to wait a month for results. That's a major issue. So we need to sort of think through what's the most strategic use of the limited resources we have, but this is a possible use as well. And then I think the question is, aside from that, is whether there's a role performing what are called biomonitoring or exposure study. So let me tell you what I mean by those. Federally, nationally, there is a biomonitoring program. So there's a random sampling of thousands of individuals each year to look at levels of a whole suite of chemicals, including PFAS, in their blood levels. That sort of work is what allows us to look and see for some of these PFAS, there's been a dramatic drop over the past 20 years of the levels in our bodies. But you can't use that data to look at anything smaller than a region, maybe the Northeast region. If we wanted to go in Maine, how Maine's blood levels stack up against the national average, are we higher, we lower, or is it changing or going down? That's a biomonitoring program. There are no resources to do that, but if, so that's something to think about. If that's important to know as another measure of how we're doing with this PFAS issue and addressing it. Biomonitoring is a way to track blood levels over time in samples of people to do that. The other possibility is exposure studies. And so an example of an exposure study would be if we're wondering about what's the magnitude of occupational exposure to farmers that are going to continue to work on contaminated soils. Blood testing is a way to integrate and know what their exposure is. You would have to couple that with other things, surveys on behavior, possibly even what's called personal monitoring for particulate matter that they're breathing in. That could be done. If that's something people want to do, you could either think about issuing a call for proposals for people outside. There's academic groups, this is what they do. Or NIOSH, potentially the National Institute for Safety Occupational Health, as people they could also possibly get involved in as funding academic centers. So those are just examples of things for you to possibly think about. Be happy to try to answer the questions you have. Thank you.
Yes, Molly.
So the data that's collected now, you mentioned going back to the state, and it would essentially be used for individual consults. But can it be pulled then just from the state to sort of get at the biomonitoring question? So it would be anonymized?
The challenge with doing that is you don't know what it represents, because you're getting basically the people that have happened to decide to test for whatever reasons. And those are going to mostly be dominated by people that know they have exposure. So you're going to get bias high. So it's a useful data source, it's, to be aware of and tracking and thinking about, especially given how high some of these are. And also what it tells you about exposure in their area.
Right.
Because just like a well water sample tells you something, so does a blood.
Geolocated.
Yeah. So it's useful in that way. But if you really wanted to track in a way of the population, you really need to try to strive at something that's more of a random sample or a pseudo random sample, which is what most biomonitoring programs do.
But right now, that data is not going into a database.
No, because right now the only blood test results I'm aware of is individuals who have decided to call our office or their healthcare providers, and it's a pretty small number compared to what's probably been done.
Is the closest, I'm just thinking about span of state, I know that as far as is the closest, the Quest diagnostic is currently where tests are being done, or where's the spectrum of where people can get tests done in the state?
Well, it'd be wherever your provider is. Let's assume that you've got a provider that works at a hospital system that uses Quest Diagnostics. So for example, anyone's affiliated with the Maine General Medical Center is using Quest Diagnostics. So anyone within that system, just a big chunk of central Maine would have access to that. And then the process is you're going to your provider, you're getting a laboratory order, you go to the lab, you get the blood draw, the sample sent off, you get the result. What I don't understand, and we can certainly get the information for you, is how does that play out for providers that their system doesn't currently make use of Quest diagnostics? So Nordic is another big one. It could also be just a question of it's a matter of time. Now that this recommendation is out, Nordics will, just like Quest, will contract with NMS so that they can offer that service as well. So I think it's really mostly just a matter of time before that's widely available to anyone who wants it.
Do you think most healthcare providers are aware of this test?
No, nor do I think most healthcare providers are all that aware of PFAS. There certainly are some in the impacted areas. We've done, we've been involved with some grand rounds of educating providers, certainly in the central Maine area. We've done multiple webinars to provider groups in the larger central Maine area. So I think they're becoming aware. And there are also at least a couple of clinicians that are pretty active in this area. There's a family medicine doc up in the central Maine, Egan area, who has actually happens to also be a PFAS researcher. He's pretty active in it. There's a pediatric endocrinologist at Maine Medical Center Research Institute, who is, I think, also a PFAS researcher and is doing some referrals. So I think it's growing. But I think that's going to be an area for us to also really work on is provider education. So that's not a barrier.
Do you feel like Nordics will make an announcement to their people? It's like, we now do this, sort of like.
I don't want. Yeah, I'm not sure how that will work. But I would say we're definitely working on outreach as others are on this. And one of the things we will routinely do is if we learn about well water result that's very high, for example, we'll reach directly out. So our colleagues at DEP will make a referral to us. We will then call the family directly. And one of the things we do is we immediately send them the highlights of the NES report and say, with it as a hard copy, say, give it to your dog on your next visit. And start that discussion around blood testing and understanding health monitoring and what the health effect. So that's something we routinely do now. And under discussion is whether we want to lower the current blood test at which we're doing those referrals.
Becca Bullis online has a question.
Thank you. Hi, Andy. I may have missed this when you were speaking, but and if I did, I'm sorry. So earlier when we were talking about cattle, you were talking about the half-life. Do we know what it is in humans?
Yes. Well, we have estimates of it in humans. It's quite variable. It's variable both from the various studies that are out there for any specific PFAS, and it's variable amongst the PFAS. So if you think of two of the ones that we most run into, both that we've seen in blood serum levels and we've seen in wildlife and animals and contaminated water, PFOA and PFAS. They're both on the order of half-lives of 2 to 4 years, generally in that range.
Thank you.
I have a couple questions. What are we currently doing with lead in terms of reportable instances?
So with, I assume you're talking about childhood lead, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
So for childhood blood lead, there is a state law. And in fact, it was updated in 2019 to require universal blood testing of 1 and 2-year-olds for blood lead. And then all of those ones that are, there's only 2 options. Either you test through the state health lab, or you get the ability to do in-office testing with a device that allows you to get the blood test result like that in there. It's kind of a capillary screening sample. So that's the current, is that what you're getting? That's the current process. So there is a role that has been established for the state to take on the role of testing, and all the testing is done either through there or in the office.
And it's reportable?
And it's all reportable, yes, because that is linked to the statutory requirements on us, which is actually within the program I manage, to do all the inspections of homes as a result of that. So in this case, we're using the blood test in a way as I hate to say it this way, kind of like the canary in the coal mine. So we're using blood tests to identify housing that's at risk. We then inspect that housing. If we find lead hazards in the housing, then we issue orders to abate if it's rental, technical guidance if it's owner occupied. And then from there, work on getting that lead hazards addressed. At the same time, we're monitoring the blood lead to make sure it's coming down.
So it seems like there's a way to sort of flip it a little bit and maybe create a monitoring program, a reportable program and testing program where when you've been exposed or if you have an occupational hazard or you're in a community of risk, that we could mandate insurance coverage for testing. And then that result could be mandated to be reported. And then coming up with the decision about what we do with the data. I mean, it could be held at the main health data network, just as some form of a body of data that we have access to eventually if we need it over time. We could maybe go in depth further to talk about what.
But those are all,
sign it.
yeah, I think to your point, there are a number of models and different options.
Yeah.
For both the role of the state or the way to build off a more healthcare model driven sort of approach.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the data would be useful long term. It seems like you want to reach out beyond just impacted farmers and residential homeowners, but you might also want to include firefighters and others who've had close exposure.
Yeah, and then that's plenty. There are certainly people that to date we don't necessarily think they're necessarily related to any land application of biosolids, but their wells are testing quite high.
Right.
So there's going to be that exposure cohort as well.
Their aquifer somehow is connected to some space of exposure.
But yeah, there's some source, we may not yet understand all the sources that we're confronting.
Yeah, there's some we call them unconfirmed source. We're not really sure yet.
Yeah.
This is a nitty gritty question, but is the linear versus the branched have a different half-life?
I don't know the answer to that. That's a good question. So I will research that and report back.
Okay.
I will say from working with our colleagues at DP, where for some of these water samples, you can analyze them separately. And I would say that to the date, what we look for there is 20 to 30%, I think, is branched and the rest is linear. So, and when we did our comparison of blood samples of the linear isomer only method against the both, there were differences, but they're not huge.
Okay.
So I don't think we're missing a lot with that. And it's a problem that will go away, maybe as soon as it's not.
And Suzanne, you may not know this offhand, but I'm curious if when we look at the background soil levels, if we see a difference in the branched versus the linear in terms of how it moves through soil structure.
I don't know this for that.
Okay.
I have a somewhat related question to what Senator Burr asked, which was, I think, and I could be wrong, are there studies happening or biomonitoring or blood level assessments happening at the federal level through, is it ATSDR?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of studies ongoing. For one thing, ATSDR, again, that's the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is part of federal CDC, has, I believe, 8 study sites nationally. So these are communities with known water contamination primarily and some other sources. And they've given funding to academic groups or others or states to do health assessments and monitoring, et cetera, associated with those. So those are ongoing and will be ongoing for years. So is that what you're getting at? And then there's also the national CDC has its national biomonitoring program, which every year, although it didn't, I think there may have been an interruption for the pandemic, but are doing random samples of the population to look at this and a lot of other things as part of the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And then in addition to that, there are, I believe, 5 states that have gotten federal CDC funding to establish their own state biomonitoring programs, which are sort of modeled after the federal, but it's just their state population. So they've been fortunate enough to get money from federal CDC to set up their own biomonitoring programs at the state level. I know California has one, I think New York, Michigan, not sure who the other, New Hampshire has one. So,
I think that's really good information. That's something I think we should keep in mind.
How were they successful?
I'm sorry, what?
Why were they successful in getting that?
Funding? Good question. Is it, as with any grant, they must have wrote a good proposal. I think also in some of these, it's numbers, although New Hampshire doesn't have numbers that are almost bigger than ours. And it's, you know, these grant applications come out and sometimes it's just who has time to respond. You know, they usually only get us 45 to 60 days to respond to an announcement. So there could be a whole, I'd have to go back and see whether we even applied at that time.
This is actually maybe a question to flag for later. I guess I was curious about, when you're talking about New Hampshire and the mandate for requiring insurance pay for testing with people here in the legislature. Do you think there's any traction and something like that could happen? Just as far as like thinking about what this fund is going to pay for. But I don't know.
Yeah, I will go in. I was actually just asking the pediatric neurologist. I was asking where they send, where Maine Health is sending PFAS testing.
Yeah, good question. I know that from my conversations, we're probably talking to the same person, that they were able to access Quest.
Yeah.
So they found a way to do it.
Yeah.
So I just don't know how general and broad that is.
Right.
For other people to do it. So that's why I think it's an area we should just understand.
Right.
And I also suspect it's a short-lived problem.
Yep. Yep.
Because again, this NAS report is a bit of a game changer,
Mhm.
because now there's a clear sort of message, this should be happening.
Something to work on.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we should move on to research unless there are any final questions or comments related to healthcare.
Are you ready?
I think so. Please call me Diane.
Diane.
That was a reserve slide
Okay.
that I didn't use.
So I'm going to give just a brief overview of the research that's ongoing at UMaine, which is changing every day. So we sent out, there are several groups that are sort of compiling and connecting all of the groups. So we had that to start with, and then we sent out also a request for people to respond, to give us an update. So this is the hot off the press what we have going. It's not a guarantee that it's everybody, but pretty good starting list to at least give you an idea of where we are.
I can see it.
It's coming up.
Yeah, it takes a little bit of time.
You can go to slide 2. So, and again, I'm assuming that we're providing these slides to everybody. So I've got on here additional information that I'm not necessarily going to cover, but here's a list of basically the units, what we call units. So the colleges, the Sea Grant is on there. Some of the centers and institutes that are involved with PFAS. So I want to make sure that you basically saw that everybody is fully engaged in this topic. Next slide, please. So just to give you an overview, if you can move the window out of the way, but when I first started back in August of 2021, Nancy reached out to Hannah Carter and myself to work on what's in the findings and recommendations for the PFAS study plan, which is in the piece that we helped put together is in the back about research priority areas. What we did was we asked Ivan Fernandez, who is a soil scientist on campus, to help put together a small group of faculty who then came up with research questions that were applicable to Maine. And from those questions, then Hannah and I worked on long range, short-term, long-term research priorities. And we've really been using that's in the document here as a roadmap for how to guide groups on campus and sort of think through some of our own internal funding that we want available. And Nancy was a great partner in working through that. Next slide, please. So in this document, you'll find these categories: short-term, future options for viable land use, developing research infrastructure, including testing, and then long-term monitoring. So those are sort of the 4 buckets. One of the things that Nancy and we talked about was the fact that we don't have health research here. We do have health research units like our School of Nursing. So that's certainly possible to put into this roadmap, but that's not represented. I'll have a single slide that sort of touches on that down the road. Next slide, please. So looking at short-term farm management, one of the first things on the list is a literature review. So basically to pull together and compile whatever literature is out there, especially since Maine is looked at as a lead in sort of guiding this process. We need to know what the other states are doing and what internationally is occurring. And what we want to do is basically maintain that database, which gives us the relevant studies, but we want to develop it into an annotated bibliography that might be available publicly. And so that involves summarizing each of the studies, understanding what its impacts might be to Maine in particular. And so we want to put that together. There's a new dean of libraries coming in, so that's one of the things I want to talk to her about, is at least establishing that for UMaine, but then how do we make that publicly available, which I would assume the group would be interested in. Also related to a database is putting together a conference. So this was a goal of mine first coming in, feeling like researchers make a lot of progress by talking to one another at a conference. And so we're working with Maine Farmland Trust and the Experiment Station to put together a conference proposal through USDA. I've contacted USDA, some program leads, and they're very interested in funding that conference. So we're slating that for the next fall. We're envisioning this to be a national, international conference, so we need some time to gather that and organize that. So I hope the group can give us some input on what should be a part of that agenda. Next slide. I'm going to go through briefly, as I mentioned, showing you each of the researchers and sort of a very brief overview of what they're doing. I've included some of the details in each slide that you can take a look at. So Rachel Shotman, who is in the School of Food and Agriculture, and her master's student, Alex, they're developing both greenhouse and field studies to look at different crops. And they basically want to look at the uptake patterns of those crops. We know that they differ. They certainly differ based on soil conditions as well. But to start to understand what are the crops that are taking up, maybe they are essentially accumulating PFAS, and so they can calculate these transfer factors by plant type. She's also looking at a management option, not just the crop, looking at intercropping. So if you combine crops together, how does that transfer factor change? This is something that's been done with drought research. So you have crops that are able to take up deep water that will actually pull that water up, make it available to other crops that are growing alongside it. So this is sort of the same idea. Are there crops that are growing in intercropping that can affect the transfer factors of PFAS among the different crops? Next slide. Related to that is Ellen Mallory, who's primarily in cooperative extension, but they are collaborating as well, looking at this plant soil characteristics. One of the really key pieces of research that needs to be known is, can we do things in the greenhouse, which is a more controlled, safe environment for our students and our faculty members, but then how applicable is that to the field? So this cross comparison between greenhouse and field studies is really important. And so both Ellen and Rachel are incorporating that into their plans for research. Next slide. Ivan, as I mentioned, helped us sort of develop this roadmap. He's involved in biochar. Unfortunately, he is retiring, but we are looking to fill his position. And so I think this aspect of biochar and that whether they accumulate and help mitigate some of the effects is going to be an important topic to continue. Next slide. So we have a wonderful animal science team, Juan and Glenda. They're looking at a variety of animal science forage related topics. One is this idea of a binder, so a feed binder that may be able to bind to PFAS within the animal. Also looking at how they can collect animal excreta and harvest silage and hay and deal with that. Looking at cutting height and rake type, again, getting at the aspect of when does the plant take PFAS up, where does it put it? Can we affect that by the cutting height for the forage? And then in everything they do, they are connecting to national, international networks of PFAS researchers and also working very closely and effectively with the industry. And so they are really a fantastic team and we're lucky to have them. Next slide. Jean McCrae, this is a project in civil and environmental engineering, which actually ended. So we did have a couple of ongoing research topics and grant funding that had occurred before sort of this thrust came out. She looked at contaminants in food waste. And so she found 60% of the samples were contaminated with PFAS. And so she worked with waste managers to see what the social science aspect and the perceived risk of that is with food waste. Next slide. Several researchers are just now getting things going. So particularly in the wildlife area, Pauline, she's interested in PFAS, pathogen infection, fitness interactions in wildlife populations, particularly for aquatic birds. And so she's working now to submit proposals. Next slide. And then Matt Chatfield and Phil Fanning are both moving into this area, developing proposals. Matt, again, in the realm of wildlife, and Phil, who's an entomologist, is looking at it in pollinators. Next slide. And Gail Zaleski as our Sea Grant Director. They are funding projects, in particular at Bigelow, looking at PFAS in estuaries, so in waterways, they're focused on that. Looking at field studies then to measure PFAS levels, and then investigating how PFAS is affecting shellfish. So Sea Grant is definitely carving out an area of focus for research. Next slide. Diane Kopek is just finishing up some funding from the U.S. Geological Survey, where she was looking at alternative management strategies for wastewater residuals, looking at the movement of PFAS in soil to ground and surface waters, and then also how that affects policy. So we have quite a few that are looking at both the physical science part of it and the social science part of it. Next slide. Our second bucket, future options for viable land use. So you'll notice that our first bucket has most of the work going on. That seemed to be sort of an immediate short-term need. And so these have actually, this is coming online for our other buckets. So next slide. Carolyn Noblet is one that already had 2 projects that were funded, which were partially summarized in this report. Really looking at the social science aspect of the Maine residents' knowledge about PFAS, understanding the pathways to exposure, and then also what is the impact of
consumers' knowledge about PFAS on Maine products. So she's really leading the team on the social science and policy aspect. And again, 2 of these projects were already funded. And so she's got active funding to support these projects. Next slide. Cooperative Extension basically wanted to provide an overview of the outreach that they're doing. They are running a really fantastic communication and discussion research group that was meant to bring together all of the groups on campus working with PFAS. They've done a pretty good job. Not all of them are a part of this group, but quite a few of them. And then what they did was also bring in stakeholders and outside groups. And so this meeting occurs about once a month. It's really a way for these groups to report out about what's going on. They welcome the public. So if you haven't joined, I certainly would recommend doing it. They have research then to inform farm management decisions, publications that are really fantastic for the public. They're listed here. And then the specific outreach contact, their email there. Next slide. We in the Forest Experiment Station, Agriculture and Forest Experiment Station, definitely partner with Cooperative Extension, but we are also leading. So one of the partnerships that we're doing is to essentially hire a postdoc in research and a postdoc in Cooperative Extension so that they can work together as a team. I think Juan and Glinda is a great example of how research and Cooperative Extension team up together. So this is another idea to essentially get fast response from a postdoctoral process where it doesn't take you a year to hire a faculty member, but we can get these postdocs in place and working on research that then can lead to a faculty position. So that's ongoing. We have collaborative communication plans with Extension, and then we're really helping facilitate the greenhouse and the field safety protocols that are a part of not only the agreements that we're making with on-farm work, but also just the protocols that we have faculty and students follow. And that's been very difficult because there's not a lot out there in place to understand how we can do this research safely. And of course, that's our utmost concern, making our faculty and students and staff safe. And so that's still ongoing and a big challenge for us. Next slide. We also have a center called Maine Center for Food and Agriculture, where Hannah and I have oversight of the funding that comes through this center from the Vice President for Research. And so we focused this funding, and I plan to do that. We plan to do that this year as well on PFAS. And so there were 2 projects that basically we focused all of that funding on in PFAS. Next slide. Our third is testing and data management, and we all know how critical that is as what we've discussed. So next slide. So we have the soil testing lab within the experiment station. We do not test PFAS, but we do the associated soil tests that are involved with the research. So when you're looking at pH, general fertility, those sorts of things, those are being run through the experiment station soil testing lab. They ran 21,000 samples last year for both growers and for research. Next slide. In the Department of Chemistry within the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, Barbara Cole is looking at an analysis for PFAS that is faster and more efficient than what's out there now. Essentially, this would be used as a screening tool to begin with, so sort of highs and lows within PFAS, whether it's present or not, and then later on be used and refined so that you can look at the levels of PFAS that are covered methods. And again, she's working on having this work funded. Next slide. Honor is essentially the lead for the on-campus group that I mentioned through Extension. He's very much focused on testing, and so there is an earmark out now to set up a testing lab for research at the University of Maine, and he's helping lead that. He also works on the granular activated carbon that someone mentioned. So it's essentially this filtration media that can take up PFAS. And then he's also looking at the release of PFAS from that activated carbon under landfill relevant conditions, and then how thermal regulation can come into essentially the PFAS release. There's a website there called PFAS Plus, which lists some of these projects, again, that are ongoing. So for your reference, that's what that website is. Next slide. Sharmila is the director of the FIRST Institute on campus. They're also looking at a nanotechnology platform for sensing PFAS, and also looking towards the catalytic degradation of PFAS. So she's thinking that this nanotechnology would be put into sensors that could be deployed, and portable sensors to go out in the field and essentially determine whether PFAS is present or not. And then there could be some sort of membranes that are deployed to destroy PFAS within the field. I do not know the details, so if you're interested, please contact Sharmila. And again, most of these groups are collaborating across the state as well, and so that's been a really wonderful partnership. Next slide. We mentioned a little bit about products and products having to be free of PFAS. So there are, through our School of Forest Research, Mehdi Tajvidi and Steve Shaler, we're looking at alternatives for PFAS containers, so PFAS-free food containers in particular. They have developed essentially these cellulose nanofibrils that are able to be good and moisture resistant for food storage, and they're looking at how to scale that production up. Next slide. Long-term monitoring is of course extremely important from a crop and soil standpoint, so that we understand really the dynamic nature in which the variability that has been noticed across soils and across crops, how that really works. Next slide. So we are actively working with our Office of Innovation and Economic Development to set up some agreements on farm. We've had some farmers that have come forward offering for research support to do on-farm testing, which is just absolutely critical and essential for some of this research that we need to do for soils and crops. So we're very grateful for that. So we're working through how to do that again with safety protocols, with agreements with the farmers. And so OIED has really been an essential part of that, and a support office for our faculty. Next slide. As I mentioned, this last little piece, Julie Goss in our MBS department has looked at the effects of CPC in mitochondria, and this is essentially a similar process with PFAS. And so from a very basic fundamental human health aspect, MBS is a department that we have that capability. As I mentioned, we have then our college School of Nursing, and I've reached out to them since that video and information. So they certainly have the potential to look at human health. And we are holding a conference essentially on campus to try to bring together transdisciplinary groups in human health. And we certainly could put some seed funding forward to help with some of the questions on human health within the experiment station. So that's all I had.
Are there any questions? Committee? Anyone online with a question? That was exciting and impressive. Thank you. All right.
I'm sorry, can I ask one?
Of course you can.
Do you have any ballpark idea when you think your lab will be up and running?
No, not really, but we're probably looking, I don't know how the process works here, but I would guess at least a 2-year. I don't know what Honor has existing, but I'm guessing not much. So I would envision a couple years. But that's a true guess.
Any other questions? not seeing any. We don't have a lot of time left, and one of our goals is to sort of sort out folks that might be interested in working in these different areas and subcommittees. I don't think it's very useful for us to have that conversation here. I think it's the sort of thing that might feels like a lot of pressure to make a decision right now. So I think that might be a better conversation for us to have over email, for folks to think about what would be the place where I would like to put my energy. And then we can sort of build out subcommittees going forward that way, if everyone is okay with that. Are there other things that we wanted to touch on?
Well, we had another presentation lined up on research being done at Maine CDC. I don't think we can fairly ask Dr. Smith to do that presentation in 7 minutes.
Well, you told me 10. Your call. I'm happy to come back.
I feel like that would be better. I appreciate the time you put in preparing. But I want people to be able to absorb it and have questions.
Okay with everyone? Thanks for making that work.
Sure.
And did you want to close this out?
So
yeah.
I had a quick question. Yeah. So do you have an initial list of criteria that have worked or not worked for the income replacement or the infrastructure that we might sort of start from or review? Because you mentioned, well, we've tried some things that worked, some things haven't.
The criteria that I mentioned really are specific to what is the barrier to entry or the entrance to working with us. And really it's confirmation of contamination, whether water, soil, or a product that exceeds either an action level that may exist or a soil screening level. And then that information provided to us. And the department then needs to have essentially been working with a farm long enough to know, essentially, in particular when it comes to infrastructure investment or income replacement, what is happening at the ground so we have comfort with that farm. So that's almost sort of like a no one to see it kind of thing.
I think that's what I was looking for. So not the criteria for entry, but essentially, what are the things that you're seeing on the ground that are helping?
It really comes back to the data and the results of the tests, in particular, and then working in collaborative nature with our colleagues to start doing them. But that builds upon the research that we have brought forward in the past couple of years to say at this point in time, we have a level of comfort in saying, based on the uptake modeling that has been done by CDC relative to hay, to cows to milk, or corn to cows to milk, we can predict X. So it's really just building on the building blocks of that data. Does that make any sense? Yeah, can you say that in a more?
Thank you.
So I'm really grateful for everyone's time. It feels like a unique responsibility to have $60 million and then decide how we're going to spend it, which is not normally how legislative committees work, but we're also kind of not quite a legislative committee wholly. So I'm looking forward to working with all of you. And as you can see from each of the presentations, there's plenty to dissect for the specificity of how we might like to tackle each topic. Did you have any other closing comments?
So the next meeting is December 12th. Same time, same place. We're looking to working. Sorry about that. Yeah, give some thought to what subcommittee or committees, or even since we haven't defined the subcommittee yet, what topics you're interested in taking a deeper dive into, where you can lend your expertise. Let me know, and we'll start to take, maybe, select a few issues to tackle first at our next meeting.
Does anyone online have any parting words before we close up for the afternoon?
Could you just clarify what is the next meeting date? I have an error in my calendar.
It's December 12th.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you, everyone.